In this video, I'm going to talk about my least favorite feature inside QuickBooks Online, which is called transfers. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually like the fact that transfers exist, but it is my least favorite feature, and I will explain why. This video is dedicated to all small business owners out there and all accountants that can't seem to connect on this particular thing in QuickBooks called transfers. So let's take a look at a transfer screen. It's pretty simple. I'm going to X out of that for a second. And I'm going to show you the way you get the transfers is simply by clicking on the new button on the left-hand side and then under other, clicking on transfers. Now, transfers are technically pretty easy to understand. A transfer is when we want to transfer value from one balance sheet account to another balance sheet account. So we're not going to be able to transfer value from income or from expenses. We can only transfer value from assets, liabilities, and equity to and from any balance sheet account. So the most common example is to transfer a balance from your checking account to your savings account, basically mimicking doing a transfer on your bank's website. Now, obviously, QuickBooks doesn't initiate any transfers. QuickBooks is only there to record sort of like what happened after you actually did the transfer. So it should exist. For example, if I went into my checking account and transferred $10,000 into my savings account, a transfer is a perfect transaction for you to use. And I would say my suggestion is that only under the circumstances where you're moving money from one bank account to another, transfers actually work pretty smoothly. Unfortunately, sometimes users will transfer something from a bank to a liability like a loan, and then us accountants have to go back and clean that up because maybe we have to separate principal and interest. And that's just one example of many where an end user inadvertently uses transfer for the wrong thing. And because transfers don't allow you to convert to a normal transaction like a deposit or an expense or a credit card credit or a credit card charge, that sort of thing. If a user uses transfer and the accountant doesn't want that, that's not the transaction that they want, the accountant actually has to delete that transaction and recreate it again from scratch, which also kind of makes a mess if the banks have already been reconciled. So again, I'm going to repeat this one more time. Only under the circumstances where what you're trying to do is transfer from a checking account to a savings account or something like that, then I think a transfer is a good transaction for you to use. Okay, let's click Save and Close, and let's go to the next example. Now, let's move on to the place where most of these transfers happen, which is in the banking screen or the bank feed screen. So make sure let's go in, if you're following along, let's go to Transactions, go into Bank Transactions, under Transactions, and we're going to go into the bank feed screen, and we're going to be looking at all the transactions that were downloaded from the bank. Now, I have really huge news to tell you, which is literally yesterday. So you can look at the date that this video was published. But yesterday, I got an email from someone on Intuit letting me know that QuickBooks is no longer suggesting transfers on the bank feeds, which is huge. Because prior to this little change, what ended up happening is in your bank feeds, the default option for a transaction that had the word transfer in it, or Zelle, or Venmo, or Wire, or anything that feels like a transfer, QuickBooks was actually suggesting the user to use a transfer transaction. So in essence, instead of it being defaulted to categorize, which is where I want it, because categorize will give me a natural deposit transaction or a natural expense transaction, which is mostly what I want, especially if I want to do any error corrections. It used to default to just transfer. And the challenge is that sometimes it could be suggesting the right thing, but most of the times it's actually suggesting completely the wrong thing. So what ended up happening was users, and I'm going to do this a couple of times just to kind of show you. So I'm basically just forcing it to record a transfer. So what most users that didn't have an accounting background, they used to have a button there that said record transfer, record transfer, record transfer. And basically they were just clicking that button without giving much thought of what the transaction was. So they were going in here and clicking record transfer, record transfer, record transfer, or possibly selecting a bunch of transactions like this and accepting in batch essentially a bunch of transfers. And QuickBooks would create transfer transactions where maybe they shouldn't. okay? Like I said, I only suggest transfers from bank A to bank B. That's it. When you're going from one bank account to another inside the same company. So if you're transferring to a bank account that's from a different business that maybe you own, or you're transferring from a bank account that it's your personal bank account, I actually don't like the transfer transaction for that. But anyway, like I said, so what happened is people were just accepting transfers and the transactions were coming in as a transfer like this. And QuickBooks would suggest random categories like inventory asset, or the worst one of all, one called uncategorized asset, which is an option that shows up quite often in a lot of these cleanup works that we have to do, where people are accepting transactions into uncategorized asset. Now I want to give you an idea for what that looks like more or less. So I'm just going to set it up here. I'm just going to go record transfer and put here uncategorized asset. And then I'm going to go to the next one and go to record transfer and click on uncategorized asset. So I'm actually very glad, and I'll give a big kudos to the people at Intuit for finally listening to us and taking away the fact that QuickBooks used to actually start like this. Like the very first suggestion they used to give you is transfer to uncategorized asset. And most laymen, non-accountants, will go in there and go, yeah, if QuickBooks suggests it, it must be right. So they would just go in there and click on record transfer. Obviously, that's not what we want as accountants. So now what's really, really neat is, again, the user doesn't get this record as a transfer as a default option. Now it goes under, this option of categorize. Now, QuickBooks might still be suggesting something random like uncategorized asset. Like QuickBooks might still be suggesting uncategorized asset, but at least it's doing it under the categorized natural transaction creation rather than recorded transfer. That's huge news. And so I think that's really, so like if you're watching this video and you are an experienced accounting professional that uses QuickBooks Online, you absolutely know what I mean by this. And flood the comments if you agree, and maybe tell us any horror stories about cleanup work that you've had to do around uncategorized assets. So my warning to you, if you're not an accountant, is stay the heck away from uncategorized asset and stay the heck away from transfer. However, if you're looking at this transaction and you're like, you know what? This transaction, it's actually a transfer from another bank account that I own. I would be comfortable with you clicking on record transfer and then selecting the right bank account and then looking at it, making sure that it's all correct, and then clicking on add. Still, most accountants actually recommend their clients never to use recorded transfer because it's very easy to slip, make a mistake, or very easy to do one and then QuickBooks starts suggesting the next one, and then maybe the next one that QuickBooks suggests could be an error, okay? My suggestion to you as a user is, if you don't know what something is, if you're looking at a transaction and you have no clue what it is, do not ever accept uncategorized asset and never accept record transfer as a default option. What you should do is click on categorize and put this thing under uncategorized expense. I'm okay with that, because if you use an expense transaction like uncategorized expense, that's never going to be a transfer. And two, as an accountant, that uncategorized expense just stares me at the face when I look at my P&L, and then I know I need to go in there and sort of clean up after my client's work. So I'm okay with you using uncategorized income for money coming in, and I'll just pull that one. Uncategorized income for money that's coming in that you have no idea what it is, or uncategorized expense for money going out that you have no idea what it is. Never use uncategorized asset, please, I beg you. Never use that. And of course, if you can, avoid transfers at all costs. Now, this takes me to the next thing, which is record as a credit card payment. That's another kind of transfer, but it's a bit of a tricky situation. So let me show you what that is. I'm going to go to the new button, and then where it says transfer, I'm going to go down 3 options and click pay down credit card. So pay down credit card essentially is a transfer. However, the slight difference is that the very first drop-down menu that you get only gives you credit card accounts from your chart of accounts as the option. And then the drop-down menu only gives you bank accounts as the source. So it's a bit of a restricted transfer that is strictly for recording a transaction where money's coming from a bank account and is paying off a credit card. Because we're not supposed to enter credit cards as bills. We're supposed to have credit cards as its own individual separate accounts, and then we're supposed to make payments to that credit card. Sometimes we pay in full, sometimes we don't. And that's the purpose of this transaction called pay down credit card. So once again, I have absolutely no issue if you use this transaction being very conscious of what the transaction is supposed to be like. Worst case scenario, if you don't use pay down credit card, you can use a natural transaction. So for example, let's say that this transaction here, let's just pick one here for this one for $88. Just make the assumption for a second that this transaction is paying off a credit card. Okay, fine. You can go to categorized, then you can go to vendor and you can put Chase, Visa, or whatever, and that's okay. You can create your credit card as a vendor, Chase, Visa, American Express, whatever you want. And then under account, you can go and look for your Chase credit card. If we happen to have one, let's see. If we have one, we have this one called QuickBooks credit card. So just assume that this QuickBooks credit card is a Chase credit card. So I'm totally okay with you categorizing a transaction from a bank. Money is going from a bank to pay off a credit card. Use a regular categorized transaction to book that. Worst case scenario, if that's wrong, your accountant can come in and change that expense transaction to whatever it's supposed to be. If you choose this option called record as a credit card payment, which again, you can do, it's fine, but you need to be very, very acutely aware exactly what credit card you're paying. If you're paying Amex and you have multiple Amex, you have to make sure, look in the statement of the Amex and see, okay, did this dollar amount go to credit card 1, credit card 2, or credit card 3? Make sure you don't send it to the wrong one. Luckily, these ones are pretty easy to clean up. I'll show you in a second. I'm gonna click on add. So worst case scenario, if we have to clean up a credit card payment, and it truly is a credit card payment, we can look at the history, open up a credit card payment and go, okay, I guess that was a real credit card payment, but it went to the wrong credit card. It wasn't supposed to be Amex. It was supposed to be Chase credit card. We could go back and fix that. The problem is, if this transaction isn't a credit card payment and I want to make it an expense of some sort, I can't. These transactions, both pay down credit card and transfers, are pretty restrictive. Like I would literally have to come in here, delete the transaction, and create it again because I'm correcting an issue. So once again, if you're going to be using record a transfer, only when it's bank account to bank account, and record a credit card payment when you actually know that that payment is actually money coming from the bank to the credit card and you can verify. Otherwise, worst case scenario, you can choose categorized, and categorized will never get it wrong. So that's a really important piece. Okay, circle back to transfers for a second. I'm going to go back and take a look at one of the transfers. Some people ask me, Hector, why wouldn't you do transfers through a journal entry? Okay, you can do that too. As a matter of fact, a transfer, it's actually a journal entry. Actually, as a matter of fact, every QuickBooks transaction is actually a journal entry in disguise. When you see money coming from checking account to savings account, that's actually a credit to the checking account and a debit to the savings account. It doesn't show you quite in those terms, but if you click down here where it says more, and most transactions in QuickBooks give you the little more button, and you go down to transaction journal, you actually get a report where you get to see the debits and the credits. So you see right here, it's very clear that this actually was a journal entry deep inside, right? Credit to checking, debit to the savings account. So always count on that every transaction in QuickBooks is really a journal entry in disguise. So could you use a journal entry? Absolutely. If you go back into the new button and then click on journal entry, you would achieve the exact same thing by coming into here and choosing checking and crediting $10,000 and coming here into savings and debiting $10,000. That is the equivalent of a transfer coming from the amount being credited to the amount being debited. So I'm going to click on save and I'm going to go into the register just to kind of show you that. So I'm going to go into the chart of accounts and I'll go into the savings register. And essentially, you're going to see two transactions that look identical. Here it is. There's $10,000, which is a transfer, which is a natural transaction that I showed you from to. And then there's a journal entry for $10,000. Same thing. If I delete one of those, I would still be able to reconcile my banks, no problem. And there's one last thing worth covering, which is there's something in QuickBooks Online called a paired transaction, which is actually a paired transfer. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to scroll down here And you're going to notice that there's a transaction here that says paired to another transaction. And then under it says transfer to Chase 222. Now, what this means is that QuickBooks noticed that you downloaded from one bank account a dollar amount of $88 coming in, and approximately around the same date on a different bank account, we saw the money come out or in or out or whatever the pairing of that transfer would be. So let me show you that. We have $88 in this case coming out of this account, and we are looking at account 111. And then I'm going to go to account 222, and I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find now $88 received. So at any point in time that QuickBooks notices that you connected two banks, right? Checking and saving, or checking 111 and checking 222. When you connected two banks and both sides contain the same dollar amount in opposite sides, once again, we got $88 coming in this case, from Chase 111. If I switch over here to Chase 111, then we're going to see the $88 coming out into Chase 222. So at any point in time that QuickBooks sees the dollar amounts at approximately the same dates, QuickBooks is actually going to suggest this thing called paired to another transaction, and this will default to transfer. So this is the only situation where QuickBooks will continue to suggest a transfer transaction, and for most cases, this is actually right. This is great. It doesn't get it right 100% of the times, but I think it's 99% of the time. So just make sure that the transaction is the same. Take a look at the transaction on both sides. And if in fact that is a transfer, if you actually click on record transfer in here, what's really neat about this, it actually records a transaction in both sides. It records a single transaction and it matches it up in both sides. So if I click on record transfer, it creates a transaction on this register, but immediately puts the transaction on the other register and matches it on the other side. So if I switch over to Chase 222, you will notice that now that $88 transaction is no longer here, because now it grabs the transaction from both sides and matches it to its single transfer transaction, which is awesome. So I'm going to click on the transactions menu here and look at the $88 transaction, and we get to see a single transaction, right, which was created from 111 into 222. But then up here it says two online banking matches, and if you click on that, you actually get to see both matches from both sides of the bank. And assuming this is correct and this is accurate, you leave it like that. If you mistakenly match to things that you weren't supposed to match, just click on unmatch for both, unmatch and unmatch, and it releases a transaction back into bank feeds. Unfortunately, it doesn't delete the transfer, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this transfer here. It just unmatches it, but it keeps the transaction there. But if I scroll down, it'll try to match it one more time. So worst case scenario, if you're looking at this transaction and you're like, you know what, that's not supposed to be a paired transaction. QuickBooks made a mistake. That's not what I wanted. You can actually click on unpair. Unpair is different than unmatch. Unmatch is you already created it and it matched it. Unpair means breaking this relationship of paired transactions. So if I click on unpair, it breaks a relationship and it keeps this $88 transaction as a singular transaction. Now it could be put into categorize, match, or record transfer. You actually have whatever freedom you want from categorizing this. And if I go and open up the transaction on the other side, on 111, you will notice that the $88 transaction is sitting here. It's still paired from this side, but I can also unpair it here. But listen, this is why this is happening. If I actually unpair the transaction here, and I don't do anything with it, I only unpaired it and I did nothing with it, and I go back and switch accounts, naturally, QuickBooks is going to continue to try to pair these transactions. Look, it's still sitting there trying to pair. I'll go back. You'll still sit there trying to pair. Okay, you need to understand how the behavior works. If I actually unpair this one, but do something with it, like clicking on categorize, and then making this whatever, right? Categorizing as an expense. If I actually get it out of bank feeds and add it, then when I switch over to the other side, then it will just not suggest pair at all. Like I don't have to unpair in both sides. I just have to unpair it and create the transaction. Now assume for a second that maybe I unpair the transaction but didn't actually create it. The cool thing about it is even after I unpair it, if I actually refresh the screen, QuickBooks ignores what you did with unpairing and repairs it. Okay, so just keep in mind that the unpairing action is only for when you're gonna unpair and then actually do something with the transaction other than a paired transfer. So anyway, I know we covered a lot of stuff. Hopefully you can go back, rewatch the video. If you're an accounting professional, share this with your clients. Okay, I want to make sure that every small business owner in the world understand what us accountants have to go through with dealing with transfers in QuickBooks Online. And if you're a small business owner and you're watching this, share this with your accountant because it would be really, really neat for your accountant to see that you are trying to understand this particular portion so you guys can collaborate better. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Add in the comments below anything, whatever you thought about this video. Hit a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you get other videos like this when I upload it. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.